Hey everyone, welcome to... No, shut up, Google. Hey everyone, welcome to Legend Makers. This is a special interview show for the convention, LegendHaven. We're hoping you're enjoying the con today, unless you're catching the replay afterwards. Today we are joined by Katy Campbell, an amazing mentor and first legend with Legend Fiction. Hey Katy, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, Dominic?
Awesome. Today we are talking about humor. What's the title for your talk? What you got?
Yeah, so the title of my talk is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Power of Humor, which is, of course, a take on one of my favorite books, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
So for
that's
those who don't know too much about that book, could you outline that briefly? Like, why is it awesome?
It is awesome because it is oh man, how do I even describe it? It's like
Brilliance of it.
it's a very funny book about an Earthman who has to leave Earth because the aliens blow up his planet to build like a space freeway where the planet is. And one of his friends, who's been secretly an alien the entire time, kidnaps him off of Earth right before it gets blown up because he's known about it. And he takes him on this crazy space adventure where all this really funny stuff happens. And there's just so much social commentary in it. You know, it makes fun of everyone from like bureaucrats to philosophers to everybody. So it's just a book where nothing is sacred. No one is sacred. Everybody gets roasted.
So let's get into that. What do you think of when you think of humor?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would flip that back around on you. What do you think of when you think of humor?
Well, I mean, I think of initially like slapstick comedy. Hardy, what was those two guys growing up? Oliver and Hardy, Laurel and Hardy, or Jerry Lewis. Those were the kinds of things. I mean, partly slapstick or jokes or stand up. I'm not even sure. I've never thought more concretely about it.
Yeah, I mean, and those are probably the types of things that most people would think of if you just ask them, like, what is humor?
Mm-hmm.
But I view humor as a byproduct of joy, which is one of the natural fruits of the Holy Spirit. So there's also a kind of cynical humor, which we can talk about, which we'll talk about during the talk, which is not, a byproduct of the Holy Spirit, but it's more like somebody covering up unresolved issues and using toxic humor to deal with them. But I'd say humor in its truest form comes from the Holy Spirit and is a byproduct of joy.
Nice. I like that. Keep going.
Yeah. So to prove my point, I'm not just, pulling this out of thin air. That I can actually show you examples in the Bible of when this happens. So the very first thing, after the Holy Spirit comes on the apostles in Acts, right? They're all out, they're preaching the good news to everybody. They're speaking in every single language. Now, nobody's had a line of dialogue yet until Peter comes out and says, everyone, they hear them talking and people start saying they're drunk because they just don't know what to make of these people running around. But Peter says, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them, men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give ear to my words. For these men are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the third hour of the day. Now, in our modern world, we might not get that right away, but he's saying we're not drunk. It's 9 a.m.
Yeah, we might be later, but not now.
So not only does Peter make a joke as the very first thing out of his mouth, he makes a joke about drunkenness, right? About inappropriate behavior. So, and that's the first thing that comes out of his mouth when he's filled with the Holy Spirit. And in the Old Testament, in 1 Kings, we have Elijah versus the prophets of Baal.
That's true.
Yeah, they set up two altars, one for the priests of Baal to call down fire to consume it from Baal. And then Elijah sets up one for the God of Israel, call down fire and consume the sacrifice. So first he lets the prophets of Baal go. And what he says is, and this is a very, very funny line here. He says, and at about noon, Elijah mocked them because they've been calling out to Baal and nothing's happened. The altar's just sitting there. Nothing's happened. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he has gone aside, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." So he's saying, okay, I guess Baal's just busy. He's just musing. That's why he's not stealing the fire. And the interesting there is gone aside is actually an innuendo for making a pee. So he's saying,
Oh my god. Yeah, he's out taking a piss or something.
so Elijah, filled with the Holy Spirit, makes a pee joke in the Bible. There it is.
Well, that's so what's funny now to think about that is everybody that I've ever met who I would say the Holy Spirit is very much alive in them, they're always joking. And I think the saints are regular standing proof of this. No matter how hard things would get, they're always not just always smiling, but they're always making jokes. They're always finding the funny side or the lighter side to things.
Yeah, and you even see, like, if you look at paintings of saints, they're always, like, very grim and kind of frowning. But
Very
if you look at
devout.
yeah, if you look at photographs of saints, they're almost always smiling.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see the contrast in how people imagine what holiness looks like versus what it actually looks like.
Yeah.
hmm
Wow. Yeah, it reminds me of what is it? Saint Teresa of Avila. Lord save us from sour-faced saints. And I can't remember any, but I remember reading that she would also joke like a ton. So, what about the difference between like true joy versus like hiding things? Like you started mentioning toxic humor for a moment.
Yeah, so types of toxic humor, I would say, is first of all, there's a kind of humor that sort of puts other people down so that you can feel good about yourself, right?
Mm.
And there can be a tricky balance, right? Because sometimes making fun of yourself is really good, or like when you're friends and you're teasing each other, that can be really fun and a good way to bond. But when you're putting somebody else down,
Right.
ripping them apart, or constantly ripping yourself apart. Like I've seen that too, where people are constantly making self-deprecating jokes to the point where you're like, okay, there's something
Else going on here.
there's something going
Yeah.
on here, right? Or cynicism is another kind of a false humor or false joy you see, where someone just kind of is always making jokes about that just are very have a very negative view on life. Like, yeah, I knew they wouldn't get back to me. Like typical of, I don't know, typical of technical support or something like that, right? But so when it's that all the time, like I think every now and then a cynical joke is very funny, but like you see some people who are obviously, they just do that all the time, and you get the impression that there's something there they're trying to deal with, where every joke that they make is very negative and deprecating and cynical.
So when thinking of like Hitchhiker's Guide, what's the kind of humor that you would class there? Or I mean, there's probably a variety of different types because the character goes through a variety of emotional responses, but maybe what's the overarching sort of humor theme of the book or movie?
Yeah, so humor can be critical, right? We use humor when something's not right in the world. And we see this in little babies, right? You make a funny face and they start laughing. It's because your face is not supposed to look like that, and that's why it's funny. So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when it does stuff like, the aliens come down and they're about to blow up Earth, and they said, "We've had the plans for this project on display. You could have come to our planet and reviewed them at any time you wanted to and filed a complaint." Like that's a social commentary. That's making fun of and criticizing bureaucracy and pointing out that bureaucracy is wrong. We have plays in ancient Greece, right, where they criticize things like slavery. Like in Greece, it was commonly thought that women were incapable of reason, right? So we had plays that made fun of the fact that line of thinking. And because of that criticism, right, changes were made. So people started to think, it is kind of dumb, isn't it? How we say women are incapable of reason. Or it is kind of dumb how we have slavery, right? We think slaves are like a second class citizen, right? So because they had this humor and this freedom of speech to make these jokes, these societal norms were suddenly being questioned. And that's one of the very strong powers that humor has, and why comedy is so important because it challenges the status quo in a lot of ways.
So I'm absolutely hearing echoes now of like the court jester and how maybe that was done in the sort of literature religious sense of the Greek plays, but then you get the embodiment in the wisecracking court jester who would play the same sort of role in at least Western medieval. I don't know if it's in anywhere else in the world apart from Western medieval. It's kind of this one wild card who can get away with anything. So what can humor do then in your writing?
Right. So in your writing, there's a whole number of valuable things that humor can do. And even if you're not writing a comedy, I think every book, like all the really great stories, are going to have at least a little bit of comedy and a little bit of drama, because that's real life, right? Your life is a combination of comedy and drama, and sometimes it can happen at once and all at once in the same scene over and over again. So I think about, when I think about an example of this, right? I think about, when my aunt had cancer, right? She was a Carmelite nun, just a person so full of joy. And she was just constantly joking all through her chemo treatments. And even like when she went to hospice, she was constantly joking. And she just had this absolutely unshakable joy. And she used to say, being a very heaven-focused person, she used to say, when I die, I don't want anybody to be sad. I want there to be fireworks because it means, that I've done it. Well, she died on 4th of July weekend.
Oh my gosh.
So God has a sense of humor too, right?
That's awesome. Wow.
So I think about that, and seeing her being so joyful and so full of humor, it made everybody feel attached to her. And that's how your characters can be in your book. Humor is a really valuable way of getting your reader attached to your character, either because they're a little bit humorous themselves, or their relationships with other characters are a little bit humorous, or sometimes you're poking fun at them and saying like, why is this such a big deal to this character? Like, you as the reader can see that it's not a big deal, but the character, for whatever reason, thinks their world's ending.
Right.
So when you love them, when you fall in love with these characters and your reader bonds with them, then when something really happens, you're like super depressed about it, right? When you kill off the comic relief or whatever, then your audience gets really mad and they get upset. And as an author, that's what you want, right? A strong emotional reaction.
Two quick thoughts come to mind. One is it was a piece of advice from some spiritual writer I was reading a while back, and they said something to the effect of, you haven't truly learned something until you're at a point where you can laugh about it. Either turn it into jokes or see the lighter side of it. And you can do that at any point, like before learning the seriousness of a thing. And that lovely little story you shared of your aunt, it does speak to that. Somebody who has understood and in a way worked through the pain and then come to see the other side of it. And there's a the joy that can come from that. But then just thinking of like incorporating humor into fiction and stuff, thinking of like Thor Ragnarok and the arc of the Thor stories and so on. And this is something Marvel, I think, sometimes just lands it phenomenally. That use of humor, drama, heroics, humor, like heroics and humor constantly, So why does humor make drama more impactful?
Yeah, part of it is just because, as I say, you attach to those characters. There's been studies, and I don't have the specific ones to cite, but if you can go out and read about it, that people who have a sense of humor, first of all, humans naturally use it to bond with one another. So when you're just getting to know somebody, a lot of times you'll make jokes or you'll watch your favorite movie, and then you get to know them more and more, you start making more jokes, right? And then eventually you'll get to talk about the deeper issues. And so it's how human beings bond in a lot of cases. And people who are funny, they attract other people, right? People gravitate towards them. So using humor is a way to naturally connect people to the characters. And when you're connected to them, you care about them. I've seen some characters written where in books that don't use drama, right, where the main character is just really unlikable. it's like, I'm very sorry that, you know, you're an orphan and that like you were abused and that you're going through all of this stuff, but you're all you do is complain and be a jerk to other people.
Mhm.
And I don't like that character, right? It would be a
Right.
lot more impactful if they were somebody that I was attached to.
Mhm. I think if you think about this also, maybe from a personal point of view, how we interact with other human beings, from an evolutionary point of view, you could see how somebody who is not just joyful, but somebody who is capable of joking, why would that be so gravitating or so attractive? Because that person has a sense of stability, maybe a sense of security about
Mhm.
themselves and their environment. And those who have none of that, who are either very silent or very negative, don't feel stable or secure or able to give of their strength, uh, or their life to other people. And I think we like that. It's one reason maybe why we like that. Um, Sort of pulling this in towards a more faith-inspired discussion, why do you think humor, either in like a character or in how a story is put together and the things that happen, why is humor a good idea?
Yeah. So going back to my aunt, right? She was a person who had this long battle with cancer, and yet she was always joyful and she was
Mhm,
always laughing. And what that told me about her was that it, the cancer had no power over her, really. It
mhm,
could take her life, but God was with her, and she was
mhm,
very heaven focused and focused on God and had that security.
mhm,
And, I'm not like, it would be lying to say like, oh, it was always easy, and no, there's plenty of pain and heartache and sadness that goes with that journey, but she
mhm,
always had that joy, and that joy gave her the ability to laugh about everything that was going on. When she was
mhm.
going into hospice, um, she had this little scooter she was riding because she had trouble walking, and Dad said something like, "Oh, be careful, you might kill someone." And she said, "This is a hospice. We're all going to die anyway."
Oh my God. You know who's a good example of someone cracking jokes in epic fiction too is Gandalf,
Yeah.
right? He's joking all the time, as crusty as he is. And I'm trying to think, is there anybody else in the Fellowship who jokes as much as he does? Maybe Legolas. He's like a close second. Pippin does, but Pippin is the immature jokester. And then when he
Mhm.
comes into face with reality, he stops joking and being funny. He hasn't really learned that sort of levity that comes from having mastered reality and the pain and the seriousness of things. What's an example from your own book that you'd like to refer to?
Yeah. So in this one, Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors, right? We start
Hmm.
with these two fairies, right, who are evil. They kind of in this book they sort of almost work like in a demonic way, like just tearing people apart and tempting people, and they just like to mess with people. That's what they do. So when they're introduced in the beginning, they're like joking with each other about how they're going to destroy this prince, and how they're going to tear apart the kingdom and give it to this jealous princess who wants it. And they're really funny characters. Like, they're charming, they're fun. They just seem to be really nice. Meanwhile, the main character, Prince Alexander, he is, very insecure. He's scrupulous. He's depressed. Like, he gets torn down, and he still thinks that it's his fault somehow. But by the end of the story, he comes in and he's the one who basically just roasts these fairies. And because they have magic powers, they're holding him captive and they're subjecting him to like all these like tortures and stuff. And yet he's the one who clearly has the power and the upper hand. And they're made to look pathetic because they're just so desperate. Like, all that little quipping and that humor was just their desperation to be to
Hmm.
to feel superior, because they had that toxic humor we're talking about. They were
Yeah.
using their humor to feel superior, but you can see that he's the one who has the ultimate power in the end. By the way, he tears them down.
Hmm. There's something that's intriguing here about having, how do I say, well, you've got this phrase you mentioned at one point. I'd like you to unpack it a little bit. It's the emotional, like color
Color
wheel.
wheel.
Yeah. And the one thing that's coming to mind is, especially when you're, and I think this is one of the reasons why Marvel will regularly, like pendulate between these two sort of big feelings, because I think you can get people to keep reacting and emoting to things if you
Mhm,
can keep that happening. But if you have
mhm.
these long periods of sustained emotion, our emotions don't work that way. So if you can keep emotions working and moving and reacting, you can probably keep getting reactions out of your audience. What do you think about that? And can you tell us about the color wheel or the emotional color wheel?
Yeah. So if I asked you, like, do you think your life is more of a comedy or more of a drama?
Tragicomedy? Both, it's
Tragic
both
comedy.
together. No, obviously in the big scheme of things, it's a comedy. When you get down to the moments, it's when you can't see the end or the light anymore, then it feels like a tragedy.
Hmm. Everybody's life, I think, is a little bit of both. Like, our
Mhm.
lives don't fit into one easy genre, and that's why stories that use that emotional color wheel feel very real.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's been a moment in your life when you thought you should experience one kind of emotion and actually ended up experiencing something else. Like how much we laughed when we were with my aunt in chemo, right? Nobody would
Mhm.
expect to laugh in that situation. Or
Yeah,
this one
yeah.
time I used to have long hair and I was holding these candles and my hair caught fire, right? So I had these flames shooting up. I looked over at Joe, who was with me, my husband, and
Okay.
he's got this horrified expression. And I burst out laughing while I was on fire. and,
Okay.
and then I was like my thinking is like, oh, I probably should like stop, drop, and roll or something. So then I like went down to the ground, but I just like would expect like if you ask somebody to write that scene, they'd probably be like, and she screams or she starts freaking out. No,
Yeah.
I started laughing.
Oh,
So your reactions in real life are going to be not always the same as what you'd expect them to be.
right, right.
And because of that, when you have this emotional color wheel where you know a character is feeling sad but then they laugh, or they're crying and laughing at the same time, to me
Mhm.
that just realistically reflects the human experience, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that the complexity of our ability to respond, and sometimes we surprise ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that humor does. Is um, humor is like taking an unexpected response to a situation, not the
Mhm.
response that you would expect, or not the outcome that you'd expect.
Mhm.
So, what are some
Exactly.
tips then for adding humor to your writing?
Yeah, so there's a couple that I always use, and there's lots of different kinds of humor you can use. So depending on your personality, you might use these or not. Really, it depends. My favorite tip for adding humor, though, is to base it on relationships. Um, this is a great way, like when you talked about Marvel, right? So much humor comes from the relationships between the characters, like
Mhm.
Rocket Raccoon and how he's like kind of a father figure to Groot somehow, right? It's like
Right.
all the tension there of Groot being in like an angsty teenager. And the Fellowship of the Ring, as you talked about, because of the way the characters interact, like Gimli and Legolas have this like weird, tense frenemy bromance thing going on.
Right.
It's the great thing about that kind of humor is that a lot of times it crosses cultural boundaries, because like we all have a mom and a dad and we struggle with our relationship with them and we fight with them but we still love them, right? That's a very universal thing.
Mhm.
Romance is the same thing, right? So basing your humor on characters that are really well rounded and in depth is one of the most universal ways to use humor. So if you've got a character who's a clean freak, maybe have his roommate be a slob. Let the humor come from that
Mhm.
conflict that happens. And the
Yeah.
great thing about that too is that that kind of humor makes you realize, because you can see both characters' points of view and you know where they're both coming from and you like them both. When they fight, you laugh because you understand it. And then you stop and think, how many of my conflicts in life are based on something stupid and petty and a misunderstanding? So
Potentially laughable. Yeah.
yeah, there's a spiritual value that comes with that as well. Mhm.
Yeah. My wife and I were watching more recently. What was that? George Lopez. And one of the funny things that struck me was, I think more of human nature comes through humor than it does
Mhm.
any other genre. Uh,
Mhm.
drama, and it's also epic and so serious and like Shakespeare, and there's a lot of human nature in them. But I think the moments of humor, or humorous shows, they bring in so much more of just human living and human
Mhm.
reaction and understanding of how humans work and think and
Mhm.
do things. Um, so okay, so relationships and point of view is one good tip. What's another one you'd recommend?
Yeah. So another one I'd say would be reader expectations. As we were saying before, so much of humor is based on either the element of surprise or like flipping a cliche. So one we see a lot, this is one I think it's been a little overdone, but I'll use as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? We had this cliche for a while about a princess who would always need to be rescued, the damsel in distress. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen this cliche flipped 100 times over, and sometimes it's been done really well, and sometimes it hasn't been done as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you see the princess that either doesn't want to be rescued, or the princess who actually is really tough and rescues herself. So, them flipping around that cliche, you're expecting one thing and you get another, and then you laugh because it's funny. Like, I wasn't expecting that. I didn't see where that was going.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, is like cliches are not always the enemy. You can use
Right.
cliches in all kinds of ways to play with your reader expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so definitely take advantage of that. Lead the reader to start thinking one thing, and then at the last minute, throw something else at them that they would never see coming.
I think Gallivant, that musical series, it did that. There were some moments that were just awesome, like that, and just
That,
cliched everywhere.
yeah, that show is hilarious.
So, okay, so in starting to wrap up, then what's a third point that you'd like to share?
This one I named after my favorite, probably my favorite kids movie, which is The Pirates Band of Misfits, or Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists if you're in the UK.
Okay.
Uh, this is the surprisingly curvaceous pirate. This In that movie, you have this band of goofy pirates. One of them is very curvy and has a false beard and is obviously a woman the
Mm-hmm.
whole time, but nobody in the crew ever figures it out. And it's
Mm-hmm.
never addressed in the movie at all. And there's like all these scenes where like she almost gets caught and you keep expecting, oh, the movie's going to deal with this now. They're going to confront her. No, it's just there and nobody, only the audience understands that this is real.
Right.
I thought that was so funny that like now in every single book I write, there's at least one surprisingly curvaceous pirate, which is
Okay.
which is something that's blatantly obvious to the readers that the characters just never figure out, goes right over their heads.
That's fun. That's fun. What's a good way to strike a balance then between comedy and drama? Does it just come down to your style, or is there like it's like it's how you measure stuff like a recipe?
Yeah, so that can be a challenge, but I'd say practice is the first thing. But I think it really comes down to just be a very good observer of your own life and your own emotions. Don't think like, oh, this is a drama, so I can't put this joke in here. It's like, would that happen in real life? Sure, put the joke in there. Or just try it, right? Throw in some humor and don't worry about the tone, and then show it to someone and they'll tell you if your tone is off. So I'd say observation of your own emotions and your own life is step one. Step two is trial and error. Try it, show it to someone, see if the
Mhm.
feel is right, and go from there. Mhm.
Okay. What are some tips for being cautious with humor? Where can it go wrong?
Yeah. So the primary things to think about are first, so cultural humor. So humor doesn't always cross cultural boundaries, right? Because every
Mhm.
culture has sort of these references and almost like in jokes that maybe it's really funny in, I don't know, New Jersey because of that one political ad that ran in New Jersey that one time. So it's really
Mhm.
funny to people there, but to people elsewhere, they're not going to get it. So it's just going to fall flat. So think about that. Like, is this joke one that's going to cross cultural boundaries, or is it just going to confuse everyone who's not, in on the joke, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that's number one, is just think about those cultural boundaries and who your target audience is as well. And then people will often wonder, like, is this joke offensive, or is it okay. And I'd say the answer for that is also have somebody read through it. If you feel like maybe there's a line, so a good example of this is in VeggieTales Jonah. There's this joke where he's singing the song about like in the beginning about like the Levitical laws and like kosher food and stuff. And he says, don't eat pigs, don't eat bats, don't eat beetles, flies, or gnats. And he passes these 3 stores, and then they flip the signs so that they're all showing that they're selling bagels. So it's kind of like a joke about Jewish culture. And Phil Vischer was actually worried that it would be offensive. So he got a whole bunch of his Jewish friends together and he had them watch. He's like, is this too offensive? And they're like, no, this is hilarious. So if you're not sure, if you have something like that you're not sure it's going to be offensive, I'd say get not just one, because everyone has different sensitivities, right?
Mhm.
But several, a bunch of people from whoever you think might be offensive and run it by them. So feedback is the answer to that.
Fantastic. Cool. Well, thank you for coming on today, Katy. And I hope that people got a bunch out of this. If you like writing humor, do it. Anything you want to end with?
Yeah, so I am super excited to meet with you all live at the conference. So you guys can ask me your questions or bring your discussion topics. I'll be in a booth, a virtual booth at the conference, so you can come talk to me. And everybody who shows up at my booth, I'm going to put your names in a drawing to win my 3 books on paperback that I wrote. So if you show up, I will put your name in and you might win those books. So I will see you there.
That is awesome. So thanks everyone for joining us at LegendHaven, which is our very first online convention. And if you've never heard of Legend Fiction, well, we are the creative community for modern Catholic and Orthodox authors. You can join our private community to share your works in progress, give and get feedback, and make friends. Till next time, keep writing and check us out at legendfiction.com. Thanks again, Katy.